Awesome. Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, March 28th, 2023. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. This is a CNCF certified meeting, so please be nice to each other. And yeah, let's have a good one today. Hopping right in, I see some new folks on the call. Igor or Sarah Squami, do you want to give kind of a quick intro while you're here?
Yeah, definitely. Interesting. So, yeah, thank you very much for providing access to this meeting. I get acquainted with this whole infrastructure of SIG networks and Kubernetes groups after the latest Scale conference. Scale, South California Linux Expo, which took place a couple of weeks ago. I gave a talk on at the conference on how we migrated to Kubernetes at San Diego Supercomputer Center. That's basically where I'm working, and I'm in a small group within the whole thing responsible for SysB PDB. It's a protein data bank, so we when biologists discover a new protein structures, they deposited it into our data bank, and our group is responsible for providing the website. Well, not only, but mainly website access to the data bank and basically comprehensive search engine for protein structures. So you can search by similarities, and also we provide a lot of tools around those protein structures. And specifically, I am responsible for designing and implementing a Kubernetes platform for that search engine. So that's why I got into, let's say, Kubernetes world. And as along the way of designing that platform, I bumped into several issues, implementations, specifically with the Ingress. And then I met Susan Wu from Google on the Scale conference talking about the Gateway API. And I thought, well, that might be a great opportunity for, let's say, scientific world to be a part of the Kubernetes community. And since we have especially as a scientific world, we have sometimes very different requirements for, let's say, Kubernetes platforms. So, for instance, I know if you run, for instance, some kind of huge physics experiments and you gather tons of data and you want to then somehow post-process it, it's let's call it a batch work. So you just drop it into whatever cluster you have, and then just do a lot of stuff with the data, and then you give you the result. So it's a little bit different from, let's say, if you just run a web server with some stuff in it. And another aspect of my life is control systems. So some software which operates the scientific instruments. That's usually just a bunch of custom-made hardware that might exist like only a single exemplar on the planet. And also I see a lot of possibilities using Kubernetes in that field. So I hope I might be kind of useful, provide a useful input from those fields. Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you, Igor. Yeah, it's awesome to have you, and keep on chugging. Sarah Squami, am I saying your name right?
Hello, I'm Sarah. Yeah, Kasmi is my surname. So yeah, I'm here for the first time. I'm trying to get involved in the community. So I'm here to learn and to see if I can be useful. So yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you guys
Awesome.
thank you.
Excellent. So love new faces here. I'll go ahead and post the agenda document in our meeting chat so you can kind of see what we've been doing, find some more useful links there. This meeting specifically is mostly around network policy and accompanying APIs. More specifically, we've been working on admin network policy, which is a global version of network policy. So that's kind of what you're going to hear more about today. On that note, we can go ahead and hop into the agenda. Surya, are you just looking for a review on these PRs, or do you want to talk to them a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the first one is pretty straightforward. Can you hear me?
Yep.
The first one is pretty straightforward. We talked about this in the previous meeting. We wanted to clarify how the relative order of precedence would look like for the rules within the ingress and egress array. It's just a doc change, I'd say. The second one, which we might want to talk a bit on that. We had an issue around this, right? Like I think Dan Winship opened it initially, and then we had a discussion. But what this PR essentially is doing is, and maybe Yang, this might be of interest to you too. We are removing the namespace relation altogether because we don't seem to have use cases for it, at least now. But that doesn't mean that we can't add it back in beta 1 if we want to do some kind of hierarchy relations in the future, like a parent-child, which I think was the initial use case for it. But just now, the way it is, it just seems like we're expressing or using it to express an it is self and not is self with namespaces, but then that can be done using the same labels and not same labels anyways, so it's kind of redundant. So this changes that. And then I've also added more clarity to the description of same labels and not same labels, because there seems to be a lot of confusion on, is it the key match or is it the value match? Is it a both key and value match and all that? So I've tried to clarify that a bit. So I know it's failing CI, but I'll fix that.
Cool.
Oh, so does that mean that you think the same namespace is not same? Sorry, the self and not self can be expressed by same labels or not same labels. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
And the thing that allows you to do that, Yang, which we didn't think about, is there's a well-defined label for namespaces that's automatically generated, right, Surya?
Yeah, it was Dan who showed it to me, like the metadata.name or something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
So then you can just use that. I didn't know about that when we designed this, though. That was something I learned that kind of validated this for me, Yang.
It may not actually have existed when you first started designing it. It's fairly new.
Yeah, cool. That sounds good to me. Thanks for tackling this, Surya. I'm wondering if there's somewhere in the website we can add a note on, like, or maybe if we could add an example to the website for like a best practice. So just in this PR, you can say, we're removing namespace relation, but if you want to do this, just use the well-defined namespace label, just so that it doesn't get lost in the weeds. That might be really nice.
Yeah, I think I can do that. I'll try to see if I can push docs also.
Yeah, you should be able to in the same PR. Sweet. Any other questions there from folks? Awesome. More info can be found on the PR itself. Okay, so those are 2 PRs that need some more review. They're on my list to do it. I have to get back to some new stuff this week. Haven't had much time lately. I did open a new project, which I'm still getting sorted out, which we can use to kind of track the issues we need to get to beta. I know we're still ways away, right? But we've been having a lot of discussions about, additional use cases, problems with U1 Alpha 1, et cetera, et cetera. So if we could just start, tracking any of those issues that come up here, that should make our life easier. Again, inspiration was fully taken from the Gateway API. Thanks, Shane and Mike. So yeah, if there's new issues, I'm pretty sure folks here can assign an issue to a project. If not, just ping me and I'll do it. Happy to help there.
One note, the link doesn't seem to work for me.
Huh.
Is that only me?
It works for me.
Okay. Yeah, then I probably need to fix some permissions.
Oh, it's private. So let's see. I don't know why. I thought for sure it'd be public by default. Visibility. Okay. You should be able to see it now, Surya. Sorry, or Nadia, sorry about that.
Yeah, looks like it works now.
Cool. That's kind of funny. Kubernetes 6 projects are private by default. Who would have thought? Well, maybe that's just GitHub. Good
But
catch.
I had access to it. That's interesting. That
Yeah,
there's
I
something
have no
funky
idea
there.
why. Yeah, because I didn't give you explicit access. So I'm not sure.
Oh, Nadia, are you a member of the Kubernetes SIGs, by the way? Like, did you add yourself to that list of contributors or something? Maybe that's why also.
I have no idea, maybe not.
That'll be it. Yeah, so as you do more work, Nadia, I can help you there. Eventually we'll get you as part of the Kubernetes org, as a member of Kubernetes org, and then we can just open a PR to add you to Kubernetes SIGs. For everyone here, you no longer have to like make a separate request issue that they're saying like just become a member of Kubernetes org proper and then open a PR to add yourself to Kubernetes SIGs, and they'll just accept it.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Okay, and then next topic is another one from Surya. This one we talked about last week. So we've had a long-standing, you know, for folks who are newer, we've had a long-standing love-hate relationship with the subject of selecting north-south traffic in admin network policy. This stems all the way back to kind of the design of the IP block selector in network policy and the fact that we didn't really like it and there were a lot of unclear semantics. So we really wanted to put the time and effort into designing something that might be better, or at least designing an API around selecting north-south traffic that was very explicit in many ways. And so we tossed this to be kind of reopened after our V1 Alpha 1 release. So this is the original issue to track that. And I believe Surya has opened a new issue to propose some user stories kind of around this for beta. And so Surya, did you want to talk any more to them, or did you just looking for a view?
Yeah, I think I'm just looking for reviews. Thanks, Dan, for reviewing them. I've pushed some of the changes based on what you said. But just to give an overall view of what the user stories are in here, I'm tackling two issues. One is the egress. So just the northbound traffic. We will not be considering southbound since we don't have valid use cases yet or requests yet. So the southbound is not in the scope. The second one I'm tackling is the one we spoke about in the previous meeting, which is we don't have a clear way of saying whether policies apply to host networked pods or not, or if they only apply to regular pods, and we just leave it as undefined. I know Nadia has some good documentation coming up saying it's actually undefined. At least we have it out there now. But I think we should, well, at least for the new API, the ANP API and any other future API, we should be explicit and try to define it since we can, right? Like we're still in the early phase. So this one tackles kind of that, like how can you achieve a way of saying you want to consider host network pods versus when it's not, right? Like, so just take a look and see if this makes sense and leave comments and reviews. Happy to help. And then I had a question to Andrew actually, right? So I don't know what the process is here. So if it's really like, I think we should get this in the V1 Alpha 1, the northbound thing, because it seems like a pretty required use case. We shouldn't go to beta till we have it, but I don't want to be a strong advocate of that, right? Like I can be convinced both ways.
Right. So, I mean, I think we can't push this into V1 Alpha 1. I mean, I would defer to like Shane and Dan, who have a little more experience with putting these APIs together, but this is a fairly large like user story / feature ad, and I would feel kind of bad. I know there's probably not really anyone like digesting this yet, but I don't think it belongs in V1 Alpha 1. I think maybe we could do a V1 Alpha 2 instead of jumping straight to beta. I'm all right with that as well. If we want to kind of get more feedback on north-south traffic selection, because the beta version is kind of blocked on having 2 implementations. I know we have 2 implementations in the works, but they're not done yet. So I think let's agree on the use cases and then kind of decide on the mechanism for release. Like we don't have to decide that today.
I think that makes sense, yes. Just wanted to start that conversation around that. The second thing is, once we agree on the use cases in this PR, do I need a cap because it's an API change, or is because it's a Kubernetes SIGs project, you do things differently? Or...
So Again, I'm going to defer a little bit to Shane. When y'all first started with the Gateway API, I know today you have GEPs, kind of a kept mirror specifically for the Gateway API. But when you kind of were first getting going, were you doing GEPs for feature requests, or were you just kind of
Yeah,
using
GEPs were
issues?
around pretty early. What we
They
do right
were.
now is we do everything kind of autonomously with GEPs up until the point where we put it in for SIG network review upstream, which happens, maybe a couple times a year. So
Okay.
I mean, Dan can chime in if he wants, but I would feel very comfortable with you guys kind of having your own process until the point where you want it to be kind of reviewed upstream.
Yeah, I would say whatever process works, and then like only do one new cap or update to the cap for once you decide we're ready for V1 Alpha 2 or, V1 Beta 1, whatever, then do a cap update at that point with whatever the SIG or whatever the working group has done since the last cap update.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
to facilitate that, something that might be kind of cool is just following what they've done in Gateway with experimental versus stable channels. Like we could start designing, north-south traffic selection in a experimental channel, and then any other features we want before we own Alpha 1, and then when we're ready, like make that official merge from experimental into stable or something like that. But I think that gives us a clearer way forward. So sounds good to me. Still have a
Yeah,
process to figure
Thank
out.
you. Yeah.
I actually have a question for Shriyar. Sorry, I think Mike raised his hands first. I'll yield the floor
Yeah,
first.
Mike.
You can go first. You can go first, then I'll follow up.
Oh, thanks. So I think I should post this on the review comments on the PR. But since everyone is on the call right now, I just wanted to clarify things a little bit. I was looking at Shura's PR on the same and not same labels clarification. By the way, thanks Shura for posting this. And I was reading this and I found what's added for not same labels is that to be selected, a namespace must have all the labels defined in the not same labels, which makes sense, right? And they must all have different values as the subject of the policy, which is a little bit different than what I imagined. Because when we started out having, self and not self, or same labels, not same labels, we're thinking about the complete complement of what's being selected from self or same labels. The not keyword is simply to provide a complement to what's being selected there. Now, if we have two namespaces, I'm just taking an example, right? So one is say region US West and app equals test, right? And the another is region US West, app equals production. If you do not same labels, based on the definition you have here, it won't be selected because partially it has the same value, which is for the region label key, and partially it has a different value, which is for the app label key. And based on what you have described here, it won't be selected by the not same labels, but in theory, we would want that, right? We would want the semantics to be, if somebody put, let's say, 3 or 4 keys for the labels, as long as one of the values differ, it qualifies as a not same labels. Or am I the only one who's misunderstanding this?
I think that's a great question, Yang. So the definition is not set in stone per se, but that was the whole point of that PR, because we still need to clarify it. And when I read the initial KEP and the documentation, I thought it was this, right? Like the fact that all the keys have to be defined and all the values have to be different. But then now that you mention it, I can totally see that even if one of the values is different, that's not same, right? Like, why do I have to have all the values not different? So maybe that's something I can fix. then I don't know what others think, but do you want to maybe leave a comment on for review? And
Yeah. I can definitely, but I just wanted to bring it up here in the call first to see, because since we're on the call, if anybody has any opinions or who thinks that the other way around might work better, I think I'm really happy to hear. But I was under the impression this semantically it would mean what I have described just now.
yeah, thanks for bringing that, Yang. I do lack history, I must say, so it's totally possible that I interpreted it differently.
Yeah, can I add that when I first read that field, right, I was mostly thinking about that the same as the label selectors that exist, and there is an operator called not in, right, and it has a definition. So there is basically a way to say something similar in Kubernetes label selector. So I think maybe not only me, but some other Kubernetes users will think in the same terms. So maybe we should just review the definition of that label selector and see if it fits our goals. That should be simple enough. But that actually does what Yang said.
So if I understand correctly, Nadia, you're saying that we should still have the complement. So the same thing that Yang said, right? Like even if one of the values is different, we should consider it as not same.
Yeah, I think, yes,
Okay.
I think that's what it says. But I can send a link to the just definition of not in operator for label selectors. I think it says something like if the label is not set, then it's like defined as not matching, right? So something around that. So we have some source to refer to, what is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, I can definitely change it if that's the consensus and something that we need. And I think it also makes sense that we shouldn't put restrictions on how a not same should look like, right? Like if it's not same in any way, like it's not same as far as the values are concerned. Mike, you also have your hand raised.
Yeah, mine was back to the next topic. Yeah, so just for the egress, specifically the second case, the egress control outside the cluster, I'm curious to what extent you've thought about how this may or may not interact with service mesh egress controls. Bringing this up basically in the context of egress has been a recurring thing that keeps coming up in the Gateway API Gamma meetings. That meshes are interested in finding a way to support through the Gamma spec, and kind of would love to hear if there are or are not intersection points between admin network policy egress and service mesh egress, and if there might be, then would love to have y'all you specifically, sorry, come to one of the Gamma meetings to chat about egress with folks.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. For sure, I have never attended a Gateway API Egress service mesh, any of those meetings before, so I'll see if I can attend some of them to at least understand how it works there.
So, and I think, Mike, like one of the big things with north-south traffic in network policy that's undeterminate has to do with specifically ingress, which is why I think Surya is focusing on south, or northbound traffic, sorry. Because in 90% of cases in Kubernetes clusters, right, like there's some ingress mechanism that may be doing some natting. It may not be doing natting. Like it does a lot of different mechanisms. So it's hard as a CNI, where most network policies are implemented, to specify the behavior. That was the reason we're focusing mainly on northbound traffic. Now, egress service mesh mechanisms, I'm not super familiar at all. I'm sure there might be for some overlap, but we need to think like what happens in a world where network policy is implemented by two different things. Like no longer is it just the CNI, but it also might be the service mesh. I don't have an answer for that yet, and that's kind of why we left out focusing on ingress traffic. So I don't know if anyone else here has any ideas on how that would work, but yeah, so that's kind of where we're at. I think it does need to be explored. it's just completely uncharted territory, like having an API it's implemented by multiple Kubernetes entities. So
I mean, that's not totally uncharted. Like, for instance, services are implemented partly by the proxy and partly by the cloud provider load balancer code. You just need very clear, divisions of responsibility.
yeah, I guess it boils down to that. So if there was like a feature we added into the API that specified apply policy before SNAT or something, before NAT, maybe that would have to be implemented by the ingress mechanism, mesh, etc. I guess you're right. So as long as you define really clear boundaries, it makes sense.
Shane, do you have any thoughts on this?
Tell me where we're at so far.
Mostly just like egress control within admin network policy,
Yep.
and does or where or how does that interact with egress control through Gamma?
Yeah. Does or where? I mean, ultimately, I think the insinuation is that it should, right? So it's really more
Mhm.
where.
Yeah, I agree. And seeing like what features like are already part of egress control and service mesh that could possibly become part of this API, right? Like the overlapping feature set. So that's a to do.
Yeah, I think that's something that would be useful.
Yeah, I would not.
From our perspective. Sorry,
Yeah, I would not be surprised if we ended up in a situation where Gamma was kind of intended to be, Gamma being the mesh initiative within Gateway API, was kind of intended to be its own kind of working group originally anyhow. And I would not be super surprised if in the future expressing mesh in Kubernetes is a combination of Gateway API and network policy, like at all. Like that would actually, I would almost be more surprised if we didn't end up there. So that's my thoughts on the subject. As far as like telling you right now where I think exactly we're going to make that happen, I'm not sure yet. I have to think about it.
that definitely aligns with like my thoughts on here of, yeah, like policy between services feels like there's a bit of overlap with admin network policy and this kind of stuff where it's like, if there is scope that this project is intending to take on, that would be really good for us to understand so that we can like build on top of and extend potentially, or integrate with or defer to things that are going to be available within Cube and this project, rather than having varying vendor implementations of something. If we have a common thing to build from and extend from there, I think that could be really neat. So yeah, definitely excited to talk about this more.
Sweet. Yeah, I 100% think it's in scope. It's something we shrugged off because we didn't have the manpower or the cycles to address it before. But as we kind of roll into starting to address egress, like 100% in scope. So yeah, please invite us to those meetings. We'll learn more.
Cool. I'll try to set something up.
Amazing. Thank you, Mike. Okay. Moving right along. Surya, another one from Surya on a roll this week. So in the KEP, we had some bullet points on graduation criteria for alpha to beta. And I think this issue is just Surya asking some more questions there. I know it's on me to kind of go back and help answer them. Is there anything you want to try to go over right now, Surya? You might be on mute. Or did we lose Surya? Oh, I think we lost Surya. She must have had to drop for something. No worries. Cool. Yeah, so basically, I think this is just good to kind of move our graduation criteria from the KEP where it was originally created to an issue, and make sure that this is actually in our new project, which it is. So just looking for a view from folks, opinions. I think we can actually look at it right here. Alpha to beta, the initial graduation criteria from the KEP was basically around implementations, reviewing multiple subjects per A and P. We haven't done that yet. And then north-south. So we're in flight for most of this. The one thing it doesn't have any notes on is conformance testing. So I'm fairly certain we need at least some basic conformance testing to go even think about going to beta. So that should probably be added here, or at least to our new issue. So it's good to think about while we're kind of talking about all these new proposals.
I like the fact that we said that we needed a to functional and the quote unquote scalable implementation, and that really what
yeah. Well, we'll have to somehow quantify scalable, I guess, maybe in our conformance tests. Not really sure how. On conformance testing in general, I know Surya is kind of looking at creating some conformance tests in line with the implementation. Yang, have you been thinking about writing any tests like while you're writing your downstream implementation? And if so, I would hope y'all could kind of correlate, since you both seem to be the core developers on these implementations. Just something to think about.
Yeah, I think I've definitely put into a little bit of thought, and in a lot of the functionalities that our policy provides actually quite resembles what we have in Entria policy CRDs. So I think a lot of the tests we might be able to even share some of the test cases, but I definitely reckon that test cases need to be rewritten in some sort of like format so that it's more upstream conformance look like or ready. But yeah, we can definitely talk more on that. It's just that in most of the cases we verify policy can take on effect on traffic patterns, right? So I don't know if you remember this, or you definitely do, because we sort of like derived the Entria policy verification framework from Matt's work on the
right.
So
Yep.
a lot of the traffic pattern we test is like a 3x3 matrix, sorry, a 9x9 matrix, where we have three name spaces repositories in each, and then so we test 81 data points to see if each pod connection is what we expected. I think a tricky part is that because I was looking to implementing same labels, right? But for that test to be even meaningful, I think we needed at least a couple more namespaces, because for the same labels, we want to see are these two namespaces correctly grouped, are these three namespaces correctly grouped. So I had to sort of like expand the the test space a little bit to verify those. But in general, I think most of the AMP test cases I have a pretty good idea on what we should include as a basic set of conformance.
What to think about.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds good to me. I just want to make sure you and Surya are in sync so that you're not like overwriting each other's tests or anything.
Yeah, that's
sorry, Surya.
Yeah, no, thanks, Yang. Actually, I'll reach out to you offline and we can sync more on how you're doing testing with Andrea. I think I'm kind of in the same boat, and then we can work together to see what should be conformant ones. And
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to bring up is, what about scale, right? Like, is that one of the targets we want to achieve in V1 Alpha 1, the scale testing of the east-west traffic? Did you already talk about that? Sorry that I was out.
Well, no, Yang just kind of mentioned, chuckled, like how do we quantify this? I think we added scalable here due to concerns over, implementing something with explicit priorities. I feel like if we do set scale targets, they should be somewhat minimal for going to beta and then maybe more constrained for going to GA. As to like how we quantify that, I don't know yet. So I think it's something we need to think about before going to beta, but it shouldn't be like a huge, effort that we put into it at the beginning.
I do have a question, since we have experts from maybe other APIs here. When we talk about scalable implementation, or as a graduation criteria as such, how do we actually usually look at the scale, right? Does that mean that the API needs to be tested in a environment with a couple, a certain number of pods, let's say 10K pods or namespaces or nodes, or what actually makes sense for the API? Or is it something else that you're actually looking at for in terms of scale?
Do you test scale in the Gateway API upstream conformance at all? Or is that totally implementation specific?
Not yet. That's implementation specific currently.
So say you and upstream implement an API that like inherently could not be scalable. So today you're just saying like, like, how do you address that? If someone comes and says an API you're designing is not scalable, what do you say to them?
We fix it.
Okay.
Like, I don't know. It's hard. It's
No,
not something that has come up a lot, that there are not
Okay.
scalable issues, but there have been a couple of instances where somebody's been like, hey, this has some scalability problems for our implementation. And then we have made changes accordingly. I don't think we currently have anything that isn't resolved in that category today. And we're
Okay.
on our way to GA. So that's just been our experience so far. I mean, there is always test infra or whatever that can, you could set up things, but I guess in our case, one of the problems is we can't pick a favorite implementation. I don't think you want to either. And beyond that, our implementations of Gateway API can be extremely different, despite using a common API. Like the Google's implementation of it actually uses a load balancer in front of the cluster, which is a completely different ballgame than, say, Kong's implementation, which actually kicks up a proxy inside of the cluster under the pod network. So like, just there's such extremely different needs for any different implementation that scalability has been something we've just dealt with as it's come up. And like I said, I only remember vaguely like a couple of issues where somebody was like, hey, this would be a problem. So I guess my advice is just make sure that you're being as loud as you can and pulling in as many people as you can, because that's how we've done it. We've just kept engaging with as many people as we can and building up engagement so that every stakeholder that needs to be there, we have 20 plus implementations and 3 integrations, hears the noise when we say we're doing something. That's how to do it.
Yep, 100%. I think we could do a better job of being noisy. And in terms of like feedback, I've only gotten one person to reach out and complain to me about scale so far, and that was Casey from Cilium. Explicitly, he like wanted to get rid of explicit priorities, which was kind of one of our big selling points for AMP, which is one of our biggest selling points. But since then, I've gotten no more feedback, right? So that tends to happen a lot.
Yeah, conformance testing is a potentially good way to do this. Now, we've kind of done this backwards. I would say we should have done more conformance testing earlier, and we should probably already have some like tests that kind of touch on scalability, like, hey, can you handle this many routes or whatnot? We don't actually have that today, but that is something that we'd like to have. Learn that lesson from us, and maybe have that earlier on. Like, this is a scale that a conformant implementation should be able to handle. Put that out there as a test, and then if somebody fails it, figure out why. Maybe it's something they have to change. Maybe it's something where we have to kind of be like, okay, well, we got to dial it down a bit. Do this during the alpha and beta period. Do this
Right,
long
right.
before the GA period, or you will have regrets.
Right, 100%. Cool. So I'd say for alpha to beta, Yang, like, let's do what we can, like maybe some basic, you know, scale to a specific number of AMPs tests. I know that doesn't factor in like number of pods in a cluster. Maybe we can define that. But I think it's important to think about, because there were some concerns like originally in the API about scalability, right? So
Yeah, makes sense to me.
amazing. Okay, last topic from Nadia. More questions. We love questions. Thanks for making this PowerPoint. Do you want to kind of walk us through some things you put together? Or?
Yeah, if you just click on slides. So I've asked some questions last time. Now I'm prepared a bit better. I have some pictures. They are ugly. I didn't spend too much time on them, but hopefully your eyes won't hurt too much. So here is just a visual representation of what admin network policy defines, right? So I have some pods. I have some letters like for label 1 and label 2, just to make it short, right? So pod AB has label 1 equals A, label 2 equals B. So what admin network policy defines, it has a subject, right, which is a set of pods that are selected. And then it has a list of peers and then actions for every peer, right? So it's a subject and then it has a list of peers, which is also a set of pods and like an action for the connection between these two sets.
Yep.
Okay, I hope we agree here. So then if you move to the next slide, I did a picture for at least how I understood the same label selectors, right? So we still have a subject, which is everything that network policy selects. But then when I say I want same labels with label 2, which is the second letter, this picture is what I'm gonna get, right? So I have a subset. So the subject set is split into subject and subsets based on this second label value. And every subject subset will have its own non-intersecting peer, right, with the same label, let's say. So that's what I pictured here. So just please let me know if that makes sense at this point.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And essentially what the same label does is that it groups the subjects based on, you know, the label value, right? So in this particular case, if you just look at the second label, then you would have 3 groups basically, and you know the 3 actions on the right should be the same, because I would imagine it will be in the same rule, right? So let's say we select AB, AC, AA, and BB, and we say we wanted to allow same labels, for example. So what that means is that, you know, as you pictured here, AA will allow connection from AA, and AB, BB will allow connection from themselves and from each other. And, you know, the lastly is for AC, right? So essentially we grouped the subjects into 3 groups based on their second label value. And I think what you have pictured here is exactly right. It's our, you know, initial idea on what the same labels should define.
We only define same labels and not same labels for namespaces, not pods, though, right?
Oh,
Namespace
right, yeah,
is just
yeah.
a set of pods, right?
No, but they're defined on the labels that are attached to the namespace, not on the labels that are attached to pods.
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't add. Yeah, you can imagine that this pod is the only pod in the namespace with the same labels.
Okay.
I just hope it doesn't really change that a lot. Yeah, it's a bit easier to manipulate in pods here than just namespaces and then listing which pods belong to every namespace. Okay, so then if we just compare these 2 pictures, if you still remember the first one, what I'm saying is that, so what happens on this same label picture, it's just one peer rule that creates this, right? And what I'm saying that is maybe not a peer. Because if we look at the, yeah, it's kind of here. So usually when you have a network policy or admin network policy, it has a subject, and then to all the pods from the subject set, they all have like the same set of peer pods. And that is not what happens when you apply same labels or not same label selector. What happens is basically new admin network policies are created with a new subject, which is, as you can see, the same subject and a new label match, right? And every subject has its own peers, which is usually only one, based on how we can do that now.
I think I disagree with this statement. It is not a generator. Like the subject defines what the ANP matches, and then the same labels and not same labels then say that the peers of it are defined based on the, well, okay, so yeah, okay, so maybe I see what you mean.
I prepared pictures specifically for that purpose.
So if you don't have same labels, not same labels, then it means that each namespace matched by the subject has the same set of peers. If you do use same labels and not same labels, then each namespace matched by the subject has a potentially different set of peers.
Yeah. For that specific rule, and you can imagine there is like a list of peers, right? So you have some peers with the regular selectors, and then in the middle you have a same label selector and then some more, and they do not make a lot of sense for me in the same list, right?
Well, so but the whole use case for same labels though was you want to define tenancy, right? Like you say that all of the namespaces that have the label user equals Nadia are one tenant, and all of the namespaces that have the label user equals Dan are a different tenant.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, but what we are, so we usually use static label selectors, right? They are predefined. What we are doing here is we are trying to have dynamic selectors, which will kind of generate selectors based on the labels that are present in the cluster. And actually there is a next slide about that, if it's okay to move on. So that's what's going to happen, right? So if you have two same label selectors, that is what's going to happen based on which pods you have now. So if I create a pod with label 1D, there will be a new instance of that subject to peer set of pods, right? Which is basically a new policy. So what happens is it basically generates static, like regular admin network policies, let's say, with predefined subject selectors, but they are created dynamically based on the currently existing pods.
Yes.
But you don't have to do it that way, do you?
Wait. So sorry. I'll let Dan speak the first. Yeah.
That was my question. I mean, I mean, you don't have to convert same labels and not same labels to be label selectors. You can just, you know, have handling for same labels and not same labels in some way that does not require you to create multiple.
No, that's not, implementation is not defined here at all. That's what you will do anyway, from the point of that you will need to define these two sets of subject and peer pods, right? And then you can implement that whatever way. But that, I mean, maps, that can be just expressed as a regular admin network policy. That's what I'm saying.
It could be expressed as a network policy without same labels if you knew all of the possible labels in advance. Yes.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to show here with these pictures is that if we see the network, the admin network policy as just this subject, which is one big set, and then it has peers, which are some other sets, then in its sense, it's the subsets that are defined here are kind of the same. They define a subject and the peers for that, right? And then also, if Andrew, you just move a couple more slides. And one more, I guess. Yeah, so what I'm saying is also now, if you say you cannot like kind of optimize that, or they'll attach multiple peers to one subject that is defined by the same or not same labels, right? It will always be separate. But actually, if we just, well, move things around a bit, you could have tried to express something as what is pictured here. So the subjects are still kind of dynamically selected based on their labels, right? But they may have a list of pods at this point. But that's not the main question. That's just another visualization about why it's actually every subset is similar to a separate policy.
Okay, so I don't think, like, I agree with you, and what do you think is wrong with that? Are you worried about that from an implementation standpoint, or are you saying there's a better way to express this so that you can't, quote unquote, distill a single AMP into multiple possible AMPs? Because that was kind of like the goal here, right? Was to make it so that we didn't have to have the user writing like a bunch of explicit AMPs.
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, that a peer with same or not same label selector is not a peer, which kind of makes it API-wise not really correct.
Oh, okay.
And then
Right.
the other thing is that there are some ways that you can actually use that and optimize that. And also another point is that we know that tracking the status of network policies is quite a pain. And then if you have this special rule that actually generates its sub-policies, it can be even more difficult to see which labels are already reflected or not. So actually, if we could have just moved to create like some other object, I just called that randomly ANP generator, like that would just have as its subjects, the subject of this thing will be based on the label. So it's basically what we have now with same or not same labels. So the subject is dynamic, right? And that thing will generate network policies for every new label that comes in. Then we can have a very simple interface for admin network policy itself, just with simple peer selectors. And then this thing will actually maybe generate the real objects. And then you will also be able to see for which label in your cluster a new network policy that is automatically generated is already created, for example, right? So it may be a bit easier to also track it, like, and the status of it, and if it exists already or not. And also from the, if you go to the, there's actually, there is another point to that on this slide 7, is I'm not sure if subject, like as from the current implementation, if subject makes sense in general, right? Because you have a subject of the network policy in general, and it selects some pods, and let's say pod BC is not selected as a subject of a network policy, but then you have a rule. Yeah.
These diagrams are very confusing because admin network policies do not select pods as subjects. They only select namespaces.
Yeah, but you can have one namespace with the same labels as pods, and every namespace has the same labels as pods have. What's wrong with that?
It's confusing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you can, I mean, there is
So I should just pretend everywhere it says pod, it actually says namespace?
Yeah, well, kind of actually, yes. It's just that the namespaces are not selected themselves actually to be a subject or a peer. That's why I thought it will be easier to use pods, but it looks like it's actually more confusing. But yeah.
Well, no, because I mean that's the thing. Like the ANPs do select the namespace, and so, or yeah, they do select a namespace, right? I am remembering this right.
Yes.
And so, like, you know, if you look at it from the perspective of if you're trying to like get it all down to pods, maybe it's confusing and complicated. But if you just think about namespaces, like if you have the namespace, you know, database server, whatever, you can look at that namespace and say, okay, is it a subject of this same labels using network policy, and you can look and you see the subject matches, and you can say, yes, it is a subject of that policy. And then you see, okay, well, the policy has a same labels field. So the peers, therefore, are these other namespaces. And
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I think the subject of ANP also has pod selector, right?
Yeah.
So you actually can boil down to pod.
okay,
Yes.
I'd forgotten that.
But still, if you think of a pod here as a namespace that has one pod, it will look exactly the same based on namespace selectors. So pod have no labels, that these are namespaces. Every namespace has one pod. So it will boil down to exactly the same picture. And what is shown here is it will work with the namespaces too, right? So it may not, something may not be selected by subject, but then the subject will be breaking down into some subsets,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So
And then something else can be added. Yeah.
yes, Nadia. I think for me personally, I would say that I completely get your point. Right now, it's just a matter of, which way we think it will be clearer or more easier for the users to digest. We were designing this API thinking about if we have this one API that can work, maybe for the entire cluster, so that, no matter how namespaces come and go, the user's intention is pretty simple, right? It's just that, I wanted to group tenants based on a couple of labels, and I don't care if there's new namespace come up or new namespace go down. I just want it to work, basically. So we were trying to sort of like encapsulate all these complications that you have provided in the pictures into the implementation of ANP itself. And if the ANP implementation is to decide that, hey, we wanted to split the peers like this, and we wanted to keep maybe internal policies that, does what you're picturing here, that's for the implementation to decide. And as Dan pointed out, some point in the line, maybe some implementations are clever enough, or based on the data paths, they're good enough to not actually do something like this. Maybe based on some sort of like labels, generated labels, or some trick in, I don't know, eBPF or OVS or something. We can even get away from doing a explicit policy split, but rather some trick in the data paths to make this work, rather than having to split all these peers into explicit different policies. This is what we have been hoping. But what you're saying definitely also makes sense, is that if we use a generator, we can explicitly generate the actual AMPs using regular selectors, so that people can say, hey, in my cluster, I have a generator, right? So I have a intention for the same labels. Now, in terms of my specific cluster, what actual policies or what number of AMPs have been using regular label selectors can I write to each achieve this? And I would say that it's maybe easier for people to see this in debuggability purposes, because they can look at the number of AMPs to understand if I'm writing something right. But on the other hand, you're also putting pressure maybe on the API server side, for example, because in a large environment, what you're doing is that you have generated maybe tens or even hundreds of AMP policies, which are starting in etcd as objects, which should probably not be there, because we could have sort of like handled it to the implementation or the controller to internally divide this and achieve this, right? So this is what I'm taking on this problem. I know Dan has already raised his hands, so you're the floor.
I was just going to say, so you said, like, I was not trying to imply that the data path could do clever things to make this work. I was saying, I don't think you need any cleverness. I mean, the code that generates the rules needs to be a little bit cleverer. But in the end, the rules are still mostly just going to be source pod IP is X, destination pod IP is Y. And you'll need to do more work to generate the right set of those rules. But yeah, you don't need cleverness in the data path.
Okay.
Yeah, and that
I
wanted
think
to say
it's more
actually,
so from the implementation, right, Nadia? Like what you're trying to say, Nadia, is that it breaks the definition of a subject versus peer a little bit, because now that boundary isn't as clear in these corner cases, right? It's like your subjects are more dynamic and not, exactly explicit. I mean, I is your problem more with that it breaks API, or that I don't think it's really with the implementation, right?
yeah, that's only about API at this point, right? We don't have any specific
Right.
implementation in mind. So, and I actually think that what Yang said is playing the, it has a flip side, because if you do have like this network policy that generates a lot of things, right? And you say it loads the etcd or something, and if it shouldn't do that, you will kind of never see that. But then if you go and see that you have thousands of generated policies that you probably didn't want explicitly, that actually may make it easier to track what's actually going on, as I said, and what's the status of every thing of that. And so there are a couple things, as I'm showing here, that I don't think are good. And well, starting with just the definition not being correct, right? And that's not being a peer actually. And then another thing about this BC red pod, which also may not be expected by everyone, right? Because at this specific case, subject and the peer, subject 3 and peer 3 are different sets, and that is not always the case. So I'm not sure if subject selector makes a lot of sense in that case also. And then another thing on slide 8 is about a bit more about scalability, which kind of, if you can reuse that generated subject, right? If you have the ANP generator, otherwise you will need to do that every time. So even if you just have ingress and egress policy with the same label, like same label list, right? Then you will need to generate that thing kind of twice, more or less, if you're not super smart and try to unify it somehow. And here you can express it this way. And then, so they said ANP generator only allows same label and not same label peers. And then actually, as we were discussing, if there are some new roles or something like that, we can probably put it here too, and not like, again, make the original object more complex. And then another point is everything related to debugging and status tracking and everything. So the more things happening inside the admin network policy with these tricky rules that you cannot see from the outside, from the Cube API, the more difficult it is to actually just track the status and see what's going on and if it's working as intended, and debug in the end.
I think you raised some valid points here. We are at overtime, but I want to continue from here and think about it a bit more. Yeah, it's an super interesting way to look at this that definitely no one else has thought of before. So thanks for bringing this up, Nadia. For feedback, I definitely want to look at this over again and try to leave some comments. So if folks also want to do the same, we can kind of pick up on this in the next meeting, if that works for you.
Yes, absolutely. Let's do that.
Yeah, I'll do that. And I also have a doubt that, what we see here in the AMP generator, right? So if we look at, the action skip and from not same labels, I know we have the not in for the label selectors, but I'm a little bit skeptical on we can actually write the exact same thing with not in label selectors as a bunch of AMPs. So yeah, I would definitely think about it a little bit more, try to play around with it and see what will happen if we actually use something like this and spawn up a bunch of AMPs. What will actually happen? But nonetheless, it's definitely a interesting thought that I'll looking into it in the next 2 weeks.
Okay.
Nice.
Cool.
Thank you. Oh, just one note, keep in mind that that's more of a question than a real proposal of a new object, right? So
yeah,
that's
I
not a manual
understand.
version. Okay, thank you.
At the very least, like what should come out of this is some additional documentation or notes, right? Like on this discussion in an issue or in our README somewhere, right? Or our website. So let's keep that in mind as well. Amazing. Okay. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Sorry for running over. I think that was a really productive meeting, and I think we have some stuff to do. So if you get some time, review some of the PRs that we talked about today, give your opinions, feedbacks, and yeah, we'll just keep soldiering right on ahead. So thanks so much for coming today, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of the week.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.